So I was saying, without a doubt, absolutely, categorically, I support the right of an adult woman to choose whatever she wants to do with her body. So I support genital alteration on chosen by adult women. I think it's really important. I'm an ardent supporter of bodily autonomy. So I think it's really important for women to be able to choose whether it's for sociocultural reasons or aesthetic reasons or any other reason. I think just as with any other practice that involves a woman's body, that she should be able to decide for herself what to do. It's an important right, I think a fundamental and basic human right. And I think it should be upheld for all women, irrespective of ethnic background, culture, nationality, religion. Um, so yes, my short answer is yes, I support the right of a woman to do whatever she chooses with her own body.
Thank you, Fuambai. Okay, Brian, can I come to you now, please? Exactly the same question. So should adult women be able to consent to genital alterations?
I was thinking about the way this question's phrased, and it occurs to me that some people would want to argue that under certain conditions, it's not possible to give morally valid consent. So there might be agreement. Somebody might say, sure, go ahead with the modification. Whereas at the same time, some might say, well, that agreement may have come about because of coercive background pressures, or maybe the person doesn't feel that they have an alternative choice that's realistically available to them, let's say. So with that clarification, I would want to say that although all of our choices are constrained by background forces, including our upbringing, our social circumstance, our relationships within which we stand with others, our belief systems constrain our choices in certain ways based on what we think is permissible to do given our own values. Whatever we think the threshold is for considering someone sufficiently autonomous to make decisions and to craft their own life course, I would just insist that that threshold be applied equally to everyone, as Fuambai says, regardless of their ethnic background or the way they're racialized in a given society. Now, one thing that's very interesting when I was looking at the position of Oxford against cutting, which surprised me in a good way, was, as I understood, there was opposition to what's characterized in some discourses as FGM, but also to what's characterized in similar discourses as female genital cosmetic surgeries. And I thought that was striking. So the argument here seemed to be not that we should allow, on the one hand, what some people regard to be cosmetic operations, while at the same time disallowing, on the other hand, operations which are denigrated as being mutilations, even when there may be overlap in the anatomical consequences of the cutting. But rather the thought was, unless there's some sort of strict medical indication, adult women from any background should be, in some sense, forbidden from modifying their bodies. Now, what I appreciate about that view is the consistency. And I think that that's something that is lacking from many discourses. Often what you see is what looks like a double standard, the idea that white women from the majority culture are considered to be sufficiently free agents to modify their bodies, while at the same time, women of color within the same culture, who often share similar ideals and so forth, will be categorically assumed not to have similar levels of agency. And I think that that's a problematic view to hold, and that's something we could dig into. And I'm sure that Fuambai agrees about that. To finally get around to answering the question, I think that in general, it's important in a liberal society to be extremely cautious about placing categorical limitations on how adults, legal adults, may conduct their lives as long as they're not harming others. And so I think, as Fuambai says, a fundamental value in my worldview and in many cultures is that people ought to have autonomy over their bodies, and that if you're going to restrict what someone may do with or to their bodies, there has to be an overwhelmingly good reason to do that. And some may make that argument. I'm not sure that applies to the case of genital modifications. I think there are a wide range of body modifications that we tend to see as permissible for adults to choose, whether that's modifying the shape of their nose or undergoing other types of surgeries because they think it will improve their lives. The final point I'll make is, even if you think it's wrong to modify your body for certain reasons or in certain ways, I would hesitate to think that application of law, and in particular criminal law, is the default way of pushing that perspective. So even if you think that somebody is wrong-headed to choose to modify their bodies, there are ways to engage in educational activities, dialogue based on mutual respect. There are many levers to pull in society. And so another point I would just make is, even if you're opposed to adult women making certain choices about their bodies, I would resist the thought that the criminal law should be turned to as the first line of defense, as it were, against those practices. So that's what I'll say for now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Brian. And just for anybody who doesn't know on the call, currently FGM is illegal in the UK and in lots of other countries around the world as well. Female cosmetic genital surgery in the UK is not outlawed, and there are some grey areas as well for under 18s. But obviously today we're talking about adult women. Okay, so Brian, you talked about female cosmetic genital surgery, which brings me to my next question. So Fuambai, I'll come back to you if that's okay. So in what ways can we argue that female genital mutilation or female genital cutting and female cosmetic genital surgery are the same? And in what ways can we argue that they are not the same?
Right. So I am very interested and curious about that distinction that's made in the law in UK between FGM and female genital cosmetic surgery. And I guess I would pose this question for the participants here and yourself, that in my view, there isn't really, in terms of the anatomical, the parts of the anatomy that are affected, even in terms of the aesthetic. I'm just quite confused as to what constitutes FGM versus female genital cosmetic surgery. If I were to walk into a cosmetic surgeon's office, and I'm from Sierra Leone, and I wanted a particular aesthetic that is similar to what I would undergo, what I would have in Sierra Leone, if I walked into that doctor's office, would my procedure be called FGM, or would it be called female genital cosmetic surgery? So I think we have to be very careful, because then we, there are issues of, I think, race and ethnicity, of nationality. There are presumptions there, or assumptions there, that go into these definitions, or the distinctions between FGM and female genital cosmetic surgeries. So I guess in answer to your question, I don't see a particular distinction as far as the as I said, the parts of the anatomy that are affected. They're very, similarities between what you would normally call FGM. Labiaplasty, for instance, is a cosmetic procedure that is almost identical with what WHO would classify as FGMC type 2, the removal of the inner labia. When you do comparisons, when you look at pictures side by side, the procedures look virtually identical. So I do, I can understand how in certain contexts, I know I've worked with and discussed with many women, I see some here, who have experienced different forms of what they would call FGM in their home countries, and have had very negative experiences. And I understand that completely. So definitely we need to look at those contexts and understand those contexts. But I also underwent what I call female circumcision in West Africa and didn't have a negative experience. So, it's to me from a legal angle, it's difficult to make a distinction between FGM and FG and female genital cosmetic surgery. And I think it's not very useful if we're going to say that under a certain age, a woman should not be allowed, or female should not be allowed to undergo genital alteration until she is, an adult. It should apply to all women, right? And the type of surgery she undergoes should not be relevant. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you, Fuambai. I just wanted to ask a quick follow-up before we go back to Brian. For not always when it comes to female genital cutting, but often there is partial or total removal of the external clitoris or the clitoral hood. Whereas from my research of female cosmetic genital surgeries, there's not usually anything sort of taken away from the clitoris. So is there something there around reduction of pleasure? Could that be something that we see as a difference between female genital cutting and female cosmetic genital surgery? Or would you disagree with that?
Is that question for me?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, yeah.
We'll go back to Brian in a minute.
So the clitoris, and I think that that part of the female anatomy is what is really of concern to many people, to many women. There's a perception that I think an erroneous perception that female pleasure is experienced in a very uniform way among women, and that this part of the body is absolutely critical to a woman's experience of pleasure and orgasm. I actually believe that it is an important part of sexual anatomy. But in answer to your question, there are procedures, female genital cosmetic procedures that do involve the clitoris. So, right, we know that the clitoris is more than just the glands and the hood that is protruding. There is the internal part of it, and so there are procedures that reduce the appearance, the external appearance of the clitoris, where there's actually, the operation is internal. So it's the what you call it's the stem of the clitoris that is internal, that is subcutaneous, that is cut and fused together to reduce the external appearance. When you compare a woman who's undergone that kind of a clitoral reduction with a woman like myself who's undergone excision, which is the removal of the external glands and hood, there isn't much of a difference in terms of appearance. And obviously I cannot speak for other women, but I know from my own experience, and I've had, type 2 excision, that there wasn't any, I was an adult at the time, so there wasn't any change or any reduction in sensation. There was never any impairment of my ability to experience pleasure and to have an orgasm. And this is, it's not just unique to me, but I grew up among, girls and women who never complained of having problems, sexual problems, or inability to have an orgasm. So it was never part of the conversation in my own community. So I think there's a misperception, and that's based on sort of Western understandings of female pleasure and the importance of the clitoris. So that, I think, affects how people view the practice, and they tend to think that with African female genital operations or Muslim female genital operations, that it's deliberately intended to somehow reduce or inhibit women's experience of pleasure, which I think is wrong in most cases. And similarly, with the female genital cosmetics surgery, there's a perception that the clitoris is not affected at all, and this is not the case. And I think there's many doctors who perform these procedures already know that it's very controversial to mention that the clitoris is affected in any way. So they may classify something as labiaplasty, but if you actually look at the outcome, the actual pictures of what is supposed to be labiaplasty, the before and after, you can see that there must have been some level of clitoral reduction or more drastic operations on the vulva. So I don't think you can neatly divide FGM and FGCS by whether or not the clitoris, external and internal, is affected.
Excuse me, can I just interfere?
Thank you so much.
On your screen, and just correct me, please, Fuambai, that from what I hear from you, it's like you're somehow like encouraging FGM, or at least not against it.
Okay, Galaxy A70, if you don't mind, we're struggling to hear you a little bit, and we'll also come back to you once we've finished speaking just with Fuambai and Brian. I hope you don't mind, but please come back once your sound is better as well. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Fuambai. I'd like to bring Brian back in, but I do also have another question. But Brian, did you want to come in first and add anything here?
Sure, I can say a few things. So we mentioned the legal distinction between FGM and cosmetic surgery. And I just want to say more about what the law says, because it's something I've studied in some detail. So in 1985, the so-called Female Circumcision Act was passed in England. It was later renamed to be called the Female Genital Mutilation Act in 2005, I think, or 2003. But when the act was being crafted, there was the need to define what the crime was. What is it that they're prohibiting exactly? And so in the initial drafted material, there was an attempt to define FGM in terms of changes to anatomy, changes to the anatomy of the vulva. And the thought was those changes, as long as they were not medically necessary, would be counted as the crime of FGM. Then members from the cosmetic surgery lobby, as far as I understand, got their hands on an early copy of this act. And they said, well, strictly speaking, there's no anatomical distinction that can neatly divide what we think of as FGM from what we think of as cosmetic surgery. And so how are we going to deal with this? Because if you pass this act, we're at risk of having the procedures that we perform made illegal. So there was a very interesting discussion here, which is, it says in the notes from the legislators who were considering this bill that they agreed that there's, strictly speaking, no clear line that can be drawn, neatly distinguishing, all forms of so-called FGM from all forms of so-called female genital cosmetic surgery. And so what they decided to do was to say, well, if a cosmetic surgeon judges that a woman is sufficiently distressed by her perception of abnormality of her labia, let's say, or her clitoral hood, by the way, and I'll come back to that. So it's true that so-called clitoral hoodectomies are performed as cosmetic surgeries, and they were commonly done in the United States, even more so than they are now, with the thought that what you do by reducing the clitoral hood is you actually expose the glands of the clitoris to make it easier to stimulate and therefore enhance sexual pleasure. So that's the way in which this procedure has been marketed in certain contexts. What the legislator said is, okay, what we'll say is, if the woman is so distressed by her perceived abnormal vulva. It doesn't have to be objectively abnormal. It can fall well within the range of healthy, normal vulval anatomy. But if she just perceives it to be abnormal, then if she's sufficiently distressed, we'll make a mental health exception. So we'll say her cosmetic surgeon can say that she has mental distress that's being treated surgically, and therefore there will be a loophole created in this act to allow for what we consider to be female genital cosmetic surgeries. Well, this created another problem, which is that women and girls from cultures where genital modifications are widely endorsed or normative within the culture, if they are disallowed from having the modification, they too may feel distressed because compared to others in their culture, they will feel that they are, and in fact, they may objectively be abnormal in the sense that they will have different genitalia from what's culturally endorsed. And this may be a source of distress for them. They may think, unless I'm like the others, I'm different in a way that I don't like. And so I would like to also be able to modify my genitalia for reasons that allow me to feel comfortable within my own skin in the context of my community. Well, so then it seems like you could have a mental health exception if a girl from West African community it comes to England and turns 18 and wants to undergo a surgery, and she says, "I'm so distressed about my genitalia that I need an exception." So they didn't want to allow her to do that. So they said, well, we need to add a second clause to the law. So the second clause says, for purposes of understanding mental health, no account shall be taken of the belief of a woman or any other person that the operation is necessary as a matter of culture or religion. So this was just some language they squeezed into the law to create a gerrymandered line, according to which, by the pure judgment of the cosmetic surgeon, the surgeries that are sought predominantly by white women from the majority culture would be allowed on the grounds that they were useful for mental health, whereas the anatomically identical, in some cases, modifications that might be sought by similarly adult women from racialized minority cultures would be disallowed by blocking the application of the mental health clause with this clumsy language about religion and culture. Now, just to take this view seriously, what that seems to imply then is that if somebody wants to modify her genitalia that are healthy, that are not anatomically abnormal in any way, maybe she's been watching pornography and has been exposed to images of vulvas that have been surgically modified, and she thinks that's more beautiful. Perhaps this is, problematic norms that are shaping her thinking. And in fact, I think that may be so. But nevertheless, suppose she wants to undergo the surgery because she's very distressed by her genitalia. You might think that, all things considered, that's a rather superficial reason to undergo a body modification. Basically, you think it will make you look better, and you're just stressed about not being able to look the way you wish to look. That's allowed under the current interpretation of British law. But now imagine you have a similarly situated woman from immigrant culture where genital modification is imbued with symbolic meanings that she considers to be metaphysically significant. Maybe, for example, in the case of some Muslim alterations, she thinks that she wants to be circumcised just like her brothers were circumcised, in the sense that that's a means of being initiated into the community and perhaps forming a relationship with God. Now, I'm myself not a religious person, so I wouldn't find this reason compelling. But I can certainly see how, for somebody who's of a religious mindset, or who feels deeply committed to their cultural heritage, or who wants to feel connected to their ancestors in a certain kind of a way, and they say, I'd like to undergo a modification that involves the labia and the clitoral hood, let's say, but not the clitoral glands. To me, this seems like she seems to have certainly a more substantial reason for wanting to modify her genitals than somebody who just doesn't feel that they look nice. Yet the situation of the law is precisely opposite to that. The situation of the law says, as long as you feel distressed because you don't think your genitals look nice, and you're a woman from the white majority culture, you may go ahead and get a modification of your labia and clitoral hood if you think that will improve your mental health. Whereas if you come from a culture where the very same anatomical change of the body is imbued with layers of symbolic meaning, which you may endorse upon reflection, you may not, of course, you might, dissociate from your culture or leave your religious community or whatever, then it's disallowed. And the way that this is actually played out in reality is on essentially purely racial grounds. So there's no real way to evaluate someone's reasons. If two women come up to you and they both say, I'd like my genitals modified in anatomically indistinguishable ways, And then you interrogate their reasons. And one woman gives you a reason that you think is an acceptable reason. And then you go, okay, that's an acceptable reason. And the other woman gives you a reason, you go, well, I don't think that's a good enough reason. My thought is, well, who exactly is making this evaluation? The cosmetic surgeons don't typically do these interviews and these interrogations. They instead tend to make their decisions by a heuristic, which ends up being suspiciously similar to a form of racial profiling. And so, again, what I share with Fuambai is that if we agree as a society that sufficiently autonomous adult women should be allowed to modify their vulvas in certain ways, then that principle must be applied equally to people, irrespective of their racial or ethnic background or their immigration status. And if we think that it should be disallowed for women to modify their vulvas unless there's a medical emergency, then that rule should be applied to all women, regardless of their ethnic and racial backgrounds.
Thank you, Brian. That's really helpful. And as you said at the beginning, as a charity, we do talk about female cosmetic genital surgery because we do recognise it as a harmful cultural practice, which is maybe, we would say, more of a Western cultural practice. But yeah, we definitely, as a charity, think that it is a harmful cultural practice also. And so that the law doesn't seem to quite work there. But I suppose we feel that with education, like you said, maybe there's a lack of understanding or knowledge for someone who is considering cosmetic genital surgery of what the variation of the genitalia look like. So it's almost sort of a misinformed choice that's being made. So we would say with education, we'd hope that might decrease.
If I might make a quick follow-up in response to your point. So there are lots of reasons why people might want to modify their bodies, including their genitalia. And some of those reasons might be what they consider to be aesthetic. If somebody gets a piercing, let's say a genital piercing, maybe they want to get a piercing to the clitoral hood, or in men, what's called a Prince Albert, which is actually a more significant piercing of the penis. And then you include jewelry and so forth. Now, typically in contemporary England, the choice to do that actually runs counter to cultural norms. So in that sense, you might think that if a person chooses to modify their body and they're not being socially pressured to do it, but rather they're doing it as against social pressures, then maybe it seems more free or something like that. But I get very worried once we start to ask adult people to give us the correct reason for wanting to modify their body, because that can only lead to a kind of a paternalism. And what happens is that when you look at the real mechanisms of social enforcement of norms, is that it's people who have to make decisions about what counts as the right reason invariably do so in a way that's prejudiced and has to do with reflecting what they consider to be normal or what they consider to be harmful. So again, if let's say that I wanted to get a genital piercing, and you think that I'm doing that on the basis of reasons that you think are insufficiently compelling to justify my choice, should you have the authority to restrict what I'm able to do simply because you consider my choice to be harmful? Who, in other words, gets to determine what counts as a harmful cultural practice?
Yeah.
Now, again, what I admire about Oxford Against Cutting is the consistency in that they think basically any modification of the vulva that isn't medically necessary is by definition harmful. And then we can have a philosophical debate about what we think makes something harmful. And they think that should be applied to all cases. So that's a point of agreement that I share with Oxford Against Cutting. But I would just question, how do we determine what constitutes a sufficiently harmful practice for it to be forbidden? And what if somebody says, I realize that there's tissue damage, so there's a local harm, there's an injury to my body, I'll grant that. But I think that I'm accepting the risk and the injury and the tissue damage because I think it will, all things considered, improve my body. It will enhance my body. It will make my body more appealing. It will be a form of self-expression or whatever it might be. So if a person says that and you say, you're just misguided, I'm sorry, you're making a self-harmful choice, you're self-mutilating, what's wrong with you? To me, that sounds a lot like paternalism. And I start to get very suspicious, especially when women are told what they may and may not do with their bodies by others.
Thank you, Brian. I'm just going to ask Fuambai one more question before we open up for everybody else. Fuambai, would you consider the age of 18 to be the appropriate age for consent for female circumcision, female genital cutting, mutilation, whatever we're going to call it? would this assume that girls or women at 18 know their bodies, identity and sexuality well enough to be able to make an informed decision that may have lifelong consequences? Oh, are you on mute, Fuambai?
I was, yes. So I think we can ask that question in the context of other bodily modifications that are permitted within a society or other bodily practices. For instance, in the United States, there's a huge debate about whether, for instance, with transgender procedures and at what age can a person, a child, make that kind of a decision? At what age does a child know enough about, his or her body or their body identity to be able to make that kind of a decision? So I don't think that you can really isolate female procedures or female bodily practices from, the full range of options, preferences that people have and people make in a given society. I think you have to, look at all types.
Yeah. So say it was for all types of genital.
Right. And then, and speaking of types, with the different types of female circumcision, for instance, type 1 or, different forms of type 4 are so minimal and far less invasive than what is permissible in most Western countries for boys, for instance, in male circumcision. Why do we say that it's okay for parents to make that decision for boys, but for girls, a more, a less invasive procedure would be prohibited, right? So, I think that we need to look at, all the different types of practices, irrespective of gender, and all of these other race and all these other differences, and come to an agreement about what is acceptable. Now, for me and for our organization, and we do work in Sierra Leone, the most common type of female circumcision practice is excision. It's type 2. There, some groups who perform type 1, and some very, very rarely who that perform more invasive procedures. We believe that at the age of 18, because that is the acceptable, and that is a legally accepted age of consent in Sierra Leone for most for most things. And I think Sierra Leone is a signatory to the Convention of the Rights of the Child that establishes 18 as the age of adulthood. So we believe that women at the age of 18 should be able to make that decision about whether or not they want to be initiated and undergo these procedures. But for the groups that practice the far less invasive type, which is, perhaps a nick or removal of the clitoral hood, it's very difficult for us to say that, mothers, Sierra Leonean mothers do not have the right to make that decision for their daughters, that, men have the same rights that men have over their sons. So, it's a difficult question to answer. I think for the most part, 18 would be acceptable in most situations. But again, if we're applying that age across board.
Brilliant. Thank you, Fuambai. Okay, I'm just looking at the chat box. So I'm going to stop the recording.
Ba-da-bum-bum-bum.